My apologies. I mistakenly clicked myself off. So this will be lecture week 6, lecture 2, part 2. Sorry. Um, Thomas Hobbes lived through the English Civil War, and he wrote this book, The Leviathan, published in 1653, which became the basis for what's called English absolutism, the doctrine of the absolute state, based on the social contract. It's the first time we find the concept of social contract. But what Hobbes argued was in our state of nature, a theorized position, not Eden, it wasn't like perfection. Our state of nature was a dog eat dog world. Life is nasty, poor, brutish, and short. And the only way to survive that would be to give up your individual sovereignty to the state sovereignty, the Leviathan. Now, that too we can see as an outcome, an impact of the Reformation, the absolute state, which is often described as the age of absolutism in England and then in France. And so here I turn into France quickly. And we have, the end of the religious wars in France, so to speak, with Henry IV and issuing the Edict of Nantes in 1598. Well, Henry IV ended up being assassinated for religious and political reasons, 1603. His son Louis XIII took over, and then Louis XIII was assassinated, and Louis XIV took over and ruled until 1714. And in 1685, Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes, going back to the traditional French claim of one law, one faith, one king. One king, one law, one faith. It was still essential. Religion, theology was part of the state. French absolutism is very different from English absolutism. French absolutism was based on the divine right of kings, which in some ways had been the medieval view, just developed further. One of the big theorists of French absolutism was Bossuet, Jacques Bossuet, I think it's Jacques Bossuet, who wrote, politics based on the, divine script, holy scriptures, drawn from the holy scriptures. And so it's that approach, whereas the English approach was kind of bottom up social contract. The French approach was still top down. So we see it very clearly almost as the transformation of absolutism from papal absolutism in medieval Christendom, at least in terms of the papal theoretical position they put forward, to then secular state absolutism. And when I say secular, I don't mean not religious. I mean of the world. They're not part of the clergy. That's what the term actually meant originally. So that is, again, this process. Development of absolutism coming out of the chaos of the Reformation and the religious wars were still going on and causing a problem. And here, too, the problem is that in the empire, after the Peace of Augsburg and after the Peace of Westphalia, we have continued decentralization. Whereas in England and France, we have increased centralized government. In Germany and then in Italy, we have decentralized government. Even within those territories, the independence of the principalities were seen too as more or less absolute. So we have a lot of little absolute states within the overall conception of the empire or of the Italian peninsula. And as I said earlier, Germany didn't become Germany until 1871, Italy about the same time. Whereas then in Spain and then in the Netherlands, it was their golden age. And Philip II, Charles V's son, it was really leading into this period of wealth and expansion. And also the expansion of the European consciousness of the world in which we find ourselves, because this was the whole age of exploration beginning in the late 15th century, or in some ways beginning in the early 15th century with Prince Henry the Navigator in 1415. The beginning of colonialization. And then with the colonialization, we have a whole new wave of Christianization and then religionization and then confessionalization. And it just keeps on going underneath the various processes. Now I have there to the secularization of the state. Well, what do I mean by that? The secularization of the state is the myth, is what I refer to as the myth of the nation state, whereby the state is the primary concept, the primary, and the church, theology, are to serve and support the state. Once we have that, we no longer have the state serving theology. That's why I talk about the secularization of the state, is whereby the state, their role is no longer to support a theological understanding, but rather to use theological understanding to support the state in its power and authority. And once that happens, then further development is, you know what? As the state, the power and authority of the state, we don't need the religion and theology. We can let that be anybody an individual decision for people, because we still have our power and authority in the state. That is too part of the impact of the Reformation, even as throughout this period, and even much of the period that I've been pointing to here in the going into the 17th and even 18th century, church and state are one and the same. It's just which is on top. And as I've said, during the course of the Reformation, the state comes out on top, whereby the clergy is to serve the state, which actually was almost argued already by Marsilius of Padua in the early 14th century. So that's what we're looking at. Is that a new development? Well, as I said, with Marsilius of Padua, not necessarily. He wrote for Louis of Bavaria. This is part of the Reformation, what I refer to as the Reformation of the later Middle Ages. And he was not very influential at the time. He became very influential in England when Thomas Cranmer, Thomas Cromwell, advisors of Henry VIII, discovered his work, studied it, translated it into English, and used it as the basis for their suggestion to Henry that Henry proclaim himself as the head of the church. Interesting developments, very complex. Again, there's no swinging door. It's not like all of a sudden we've discovered something and boom, that changes everything. It's not quite like Galileo with his telescope. All of a sudden we look up and oh my God, the whole medieval view cannot be supported anymore. The ancient, the classical and medieval view of the cosmos cannot be supported anymore because we see new things which have never been seen before. That too is part of this intellectual change that's going on. See, with Copernicus already, and when he publishes his De Revolutionibus in 1543, I mean, he's dead by then, but it comes out earlier. People are talking about it, but it's not official. He sends it to the Pope, arguing for a heliocentric universe rather than a geocentric one, which also had been argued by Aristarchus of Samos way back in 235 BCE. At the time, the Greek natural philosophers said, Aristarchus, you're crazy, because if that were the case, that sphere of outermost stars would have to be so far away. It's ridiculous. We can see the stars. The same response at first was to Copernicus. He was rejected by Protestants and Catholics. Some did listen to him. But it wasn't until Galileo that Copernicus was condemned. And it wasn't until Galileo in the 17th century used the telescope and saw things that Copernicus never did, that no one else previously ever had. Things like the rings around Saturn, craters on the moon, things that made it impossible that the Ptolemaic and Aristotelian cosmos was an adequate description of reality. Our very understanding of the universe in which we find ourselves had to change. Beginning of conflict. Talk about faith in science, faith and reason, religion and science, whatever you want to call it. There was no conflict at all until maybe Galileo and then the aftermath thereof. In my view, that's conflict is based on a very warped understanding, but that's another issue. But that is one of the things that was going on too. New worlds were being discovered, not only on the surface of the Earth, but in terms of the cosmos. Theologically, worlds were being discovered. And the whole question then, on the final, is to what extent was this a revolution? Now, that question, which I'm going to be addressing in more detail shortly in the next slide, this penultimate slide here, the transition of Europe from medieval to early modern, saying, okay, what happened? And how do we describe it? We have differences in theology and history. How do we relate those? How do we understand the 16th century theologically, if we are going to be theologians, which is not the point of this course? Or how do we understand the impact of the theology and the theological developments of the 16th century historically? That's the focus here. What difference did it make? If we look at the broad developments, as I've argued, we go from religionization to confessionalization. We go from Christendom to the early modern state. And we have clearly recognizable historical change based on how we tell the story and put it all together. Things are different. We can see that in the artifacts that are extant that we can date somewhat relatively, even though they're still present today, so we can study them. How do we account for historical change? And how do we describe it? That's your final. With respect to this course and the course material presented to you from approximately 1300 to 1600. How do we get from point A to point B? Now, I know I've talked about this before, but when we look at the final exam, the issue is how to approach it. They have their Reform, Reformation, Revolution. Those are three different terms with different connotations. From Reform, we need to improve. The new and improved product is. Reformation is, this is a new product. And Revolution is, this is a completely different product. In some ways, that's what it is. All get at concepts and the details and how to put it together and how do you present an historical argument and present yourself in doing so. Now, if we look at the final, which you've had this question from the beginning of the course, I'm just going to read it to you again, maybe. The final is, was the Reformation in its religio-theological, political, social, cultural, and intellectual aspects a revolution? If so, how so? If not, how not? How should the transformation of European society and culture from medieval to early modern be best described? Be sure to read the Guide to Writing the Final Examination. That is key because you need to follow the instructions there. So that in your answer, you need to address the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, Luther's Reformation, and various patterns of Reformation that I've talked about that the course has been based on. You need to incorporate as much of the assigned material as possible because that is the basis for your grade. I will not be grading your final essays in the abstract theoretical sense of, oh, that's an interesting view. I grade it based on how well do you use the course material, the lectures, the assigned readings, all of the assigned readings, and maybe the suggested readings too, to deal with the problem that's given to you. Now, if you're going to say that the Reformation was or was not a revolution, you have to give a definition of revolution. Revolution is a revolving. Copernicus was one of the first treatises to explicitly use the term in its title, De Revolutionibus Orbium Celestium, the revolution of the heavenly bodies. What is a Reformation? What is a revolution? How do we distinguish revolution from Reformation? How do we distinguish Reformation from Reform? Especially talking about the Reformation of the later Middle Ages. I think I said that was my term, or is my term, and it is. Because the distinction had always been between late medieval Reform and then early modern Reformation. But when we look at the sources, they are calling for Reformation in the later Middle Ages, again and again. We must bring about a Reformation. That's what the Reformation of the Emperor Sigismund is about. Now, it's a different, maybe, Reformation than what actually came about. That's why I also said that the Reformation of the later Middle Ages failed. And I presented the ideas and concepts, which began basically with Gerald Strauss's book, Luther's House of Learning, that Luther's Reformation failed. How do we judge success? So that failure thesis, as a footnote, I think in the final chapter of my Luther and the Reformation of the Later Middle Ages book, which is available to you online, not part of the required reading, but it's there if you're interested. But I think that deals with the failure thesis. And you're welcome to cite that and use that. How do we deal with it? How do we understand it? What are the words that we describe it? How do we label it? Were these freedom fighters or were they revolutionaries? That's kind of one of the issues. The phenomena are the same. How we describe them is different, and what labels we attribute to them attributes meaning to those acts, that phenomena. It's a very different understanding if we see this as revolution, or if we see it as reformation, or if we see it simply as reform. There's no right or wrong answer on the final exam, just like there weren't right or wrong answers on the midterms. You can get things right or wrong, which you shouldn't, since this is, a take-home exam. So be careful. Make sure that when you submit it, you've proofread it and you feel that, yes, this is what I want to submit, and this is my best work, and this is what, I'm excited to show. But there's no right or wrong answers. There are good answers and bad answers. And a good answer takes into account as much of the course material as possible and cites it all. By lecture, by week and lecture number, by page numbers of, Lindbergh or The Myth of the West, or in the documents that have been assigned. Try to argue your case. So also, therefore, reread, if you haven't read it, read it for the first time, the document Historical Argument, because historical argument is very much like legal argument. You're making a case based on the evidence. That's what this is about. How do you put it all together and make your case? It's not about what do you believe and what do you think. It's how do you argue your position based on the evidence, which is the course material. In answering the question about how this central transformative period of historical change. What difference did it make? What impact did it have from 1300 to 1600? How do we describe it? What historical meaning do we ascribe to it? The only thing I said from the beginning, if this course has led you to question or reflect upon your own theological understandings or positions, great. But that's not what I want to read in your final. Okay? And if you want to talk about that, I'm happy to always to talk about that. But the historical understanding, based on the course material, which includes theology, what difference did it make? In some ways, that's the question. Yeah, that's about it. I hope you've enjoyed the course. I hope you've gotten something out of it. And I know as you're looking towards the final, which is what, due August 14th at 11:59 p.m. I think that's the official time and date. Yes, Friday, August 14th, 11:59 p.m. With that on the horizon and before you immediately now, to say enjoyment and what you've gotten out of it may not be quite, might not ring true to you at this point. But I hope afterwards, there'll be a time when you can sit and reflect and think, yeah, that was important. Not only was the Reformation important, but that course was important for me. I hope that's the case. If it's not, fine. That's up to you, but that's what I would hope. I'm looking forward to reading your finals. Good luck. If you have questions, please email me, ask Lucy. This can all help. We're here to help. And again, put your best foot forward. Read the instructions and follow the instructions. And thank you for these past 6 weeks. I've enjoyed them. I hope you have. And I hope to see you maybe in another course down the road. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.